Christopher, step away from the cabinet for me.
I'm stepping away. What is this about?
Christopher Pattinson operated without oversight for 4 years as a paramedic field lieutenant supervisor at Denver Health. Nearly 1,300 vials of fentanyl are missing, and the ambulances carrying his replacements were headed straight to cardiac arrests.
The missing fentanyl vials from the paramedic supply.
I don't understand what you're saying. The logs should show everything.
Christopher Pattinson would not get the chance to walk this one back. Within 72 hours of his final shift at Denver Health, federal agents had seized the paramedic department's narcotics cabinet, pulled 4 years of altered logs, and identified the architectural moment when his conduct stopped being theft and became something the U.S. Attorney's Office would call tampering. 1,900 vials of fentanyl, 58 federal counts, 3 years in federal prison, and a row of resealed glass vials sitting inside ambulance kits across the city of Denver, each one filled with a clear liquid that was not what the label said it was. Quick question before we go any deeper. Would you ride in an ambulance staffed by a supervisor you knew was high on the job? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe if you're new here. We cover the cases, the local news drops, after one cycle. Christopher Robert Pattinson was born in 1981 in a working-class corner of Aurora, Colorado, the older of 2 boys raised by a father who drove a delivery route for a beverage distributor and a mother who worked the day shift as a unit clerk at a small community hospital on East Colfax. The household was modest. The cars were old. The medical bills, when they came, sat on the kitchen counter for weeks before anyone opened them. What the family had in abundance was proximity to first responders. Pattinson's uncle was a Denver firefighter. 2 of his father's cousins worked for the sheriff's office. The first siren he can remember hearing was not a stranger's. It was someone he was related to, going somewhere important, and the kitchen radio scanner stayed on most nights so his mother could follow along. Friends from those years remember a serious, quiet kid, not unfriendly, watchful. He read paperbacks about wilderness search and rescue. He kept a small first aid kit in his school backpack from the 6th grade onward. By the time he was a junior at his Aurora High School, he had completed a community Red Cross course in basic first aid and CPR, and he had started showing up at his uncle's fire station on Saturday mornings to help wash the rigs and listen to the calls come in. A station captain from that period later told a Denver Health internal interviewer that he remembered Pattinson as reliable, focused, and from a service family with strong values. After high school, he did not go to a 4-year college. He enrolled at the Community College of Denver in 2000 and worked through their EMT basic certification on a wage that came to $7.25 an hour at a sub shop near the campus. He earned his EMT certificate, then his paramedic certificate, then a series of rural and urban field placements that taught him the difference between the protocol on the page and the protocol that gets a patient to the emergency department alive. He was hired by Denver Health Paramedic Division in 2005 as a line paramedic on a starting wage that, with shift differential and overtime, came to about $48,000 in his first full year. Denver Health is the city's safety net hospital. It runs the integrated public health system for Denver County and operates the paramedic service that responds to every 911 medical call inside city limits. The ambulances roll out of a downtown bay on Bannock Street. The narcotics kits are restocked in a back office that has a coded door, a locked cabinet, and a logbook that, in 2005, was still kept partly on paper. His early evaluations were strong, detail-oriented, strong clinical instincts, works well under pressure, has demonstrated initiative on high-acuity cardiac and trauma calls. He was promoted to senior paramedic in 2010. In 2014, he was promoted again, this time to field lieutenant, which placed him in operational oversight of paramedic crews across the downtown response zone and gave him the supervisory access he would later exploit. In 2018, after a colleague retired into the administration side of Denver Health, Pattinson absorbed the additional rank designator that would appear in the federal indictment 4 years later. Paramedic Field Lieutenant Supervisor. The promotions came with 2 things that mattered. First, money. By 2018, his base salary had crossed $80,000 before overtime, and overtime in Denver Health's paramedic division is a meaningful add. Second, and more relevant to the federal case, the promotions came with access. Field lieutenant supervisors at Denver Health are read into the narcotics handling chain. They draw vials. They sign for vials. They oversee the documentation that line paramedics generate at the end of each shift. In a system designed around mutual oversight between line crews and supervisors, the supervisor sits on both sides of the check. His personal life ran in parallel and quietly. He had been in a long relationship through his late 20s with another Denver healthcare worker. The relationship ended in 2013 for reasons that colleagues from that period described as the standard erosion of a couple who never saw each other, with him on 24-hour rotations and her on 12-hour nights. After the breakup, he kept a small one-bedroom apartment on the southwest side of the city, an aging dog he had adopted from the Denver Dumb Friends League, and a used Harley-Davidson cruiser he worked on in his garage on his rare full days off. He saw his parents on Sunday mornings at a diner on Federal Boulevard. He saw his younger brother, by then a Denver Public Works equipment operator, at Broncos games when their schedules lined up. The picture was modest, stable, and from the outside indistinguishable from the picture of any other senior city EMS supervisor in his late 30s. Pattinson had spent his entire adult life building toward the role he held by 2018. Colleagues from those years describe him as the supervisor you wanted on a bad night. He was the one who took the trauma kit out of the rig on a multi-casualty scene and worked the patient on the curb because he could not stand to delegate. He carried the radio. He took the call from the hospital. He went home at the end of the shift and read the chart on a department laptop until 2 a.m. By every external measure, he was exactly the kind of paramedic the public would want responding to their worst day. What none of his colleagues knew, and what Pattinson himself appears not to have admitted to anyone for years, was the parallel life he had begun running alongside the career. Somewhere between his promotion to field lieutenant and his promotion to supervisor, his relationship with the drug he carried in the back of every ambulance had stopped being professional. To understand how one paramedic was able to remove approximately 1,900 vials of fentanyl from a major urban EMS system across 4 years without being caught, you have to understand the system he was supposed to be policing. Denver Health Paramedic Division runs the 911 medical response for the entire city of Denver. On a normal day, it puts somewhere in the range of 25 to 30 ambulances into rotation. Each ambulance carries a narcotics kit. The narcotics kit on a Denver Health rig is not a single drug. It is a stocked tray of controlled substances calibrated to the kinds of calls the system runs every day. Fentanyl is the anchor. Fentanyl is the strongest opioid in the pre-hospital pharmacopoeia, fast-acting, dose-controllable, and effective for severe trauma pain, cardiac chest pain, and the breakthrough pain that comes during transport from a burn or a fracture. Every ambulance in the fleet carries multiple vials. The vials are pulled from a locked cabinet at the paramedic department's main supply room and signed out into the kit at the start of each shift. The accountability chain is supposed to work in layers. The line paramedic on the ambulance signs for what is in the kit at shift, start, and signs again for what was used during the shift, with a chart entry for each administration documenting the patient, the dose, and the time. The supervisor reviews the line paramedic's documentation at the end of the shift. The pharmacy reconciles the totals on a periodic cycle. Used vials and partial vials are accounted for. Unused vials remain in the kit or are returned to the cabinet. The standard cycle is built on the assumption that the line crew and the supervisor are independent checks on each other. The vulnerability in that architecture is the supervisor himself. A field lieutenant supervisor at Denver Health has physical access to the locked cabinet. He has authority over the documentation that the line paramedics generate. He is the person who reconciles their shift entries against the cabinet inventory. If the supervisor is the one removing vials, and the supervisor is also the one signing off on the documentation that says no vials were removed, the standard check does not catch the diversion. The system was designed to surface a line paramedic stealing from a supervisor who was watching. It was not designed to surface a supervisor stealing from a system that trusted him to watch himself. Denver Health's safeguards on that point were not unusual for an EMS system of its size in 2018. They were typical. They reflected the field's standard practice. And they were exactly the safeguards Pattinson, as a supervisor, had been trained on, had implemented, and had been the one to sign for. The institutional check on diversion ran exactly as deep as the integrity of the man holding the key. No deeper. The first vial came out of the cabinet on November 5, 2018. The federal indictment does not attempt to reconstruct his internal state at that moment. It establishes the date, because that is the first date on which the altered logs and the cabinet inventory diverge in a way that the investigation could later trace. What investigators believe happened in the early phase was straightforward, repetitive, and slow. Pattinson removed a vial from the locked cabinet at a moment in his supervisory shift when he was alone with the inventory, which was a routine occurrence for someone in his role. He pocketed the vial. He made a corresponding alteration in the narcotics log to make the count consistent with one fewer vial having been there to begin with, or to attribute the removal to a use that had not happened. The log alteration was the critical piece. It made the missing vial invisible to the next reconciliation cycle. He left the cabinet, finished his shift, drove home in his personal vehicle, and used the drug. The pattern that emerged across the next several years was not constant. The federal case does not allege that Pattinson took a vial every shift. The 1,900 vial aggregate is the documented total across 4 years and roughly 1,400 working days. The pace varied. Some weeks the cabinet lost 3 or 4 vials, some weeks none. The variance is consistent with a person whose use was responsive to availability, to opportunity, and to the rhythm of his own dependence. The supervisor role gave him cover at every step. When the cabinet inventory came up 1 vial short and the log said it should be full, the person who would have noticed was the supervisor. When the supervisor noticed it himself, the person responsible for documenting and escalating the discrepancy was again the supervisor. When the pharmacy reconciliation flagged an irregularity, the person Denver Health Pharmacy called to ask for clarification was the field lieutenant supervisor on duty. Pattinson was, structurally, his own oversight. There were signs. There are always signs. Colleagues from that period later told federal investigators that Pattinson had become harder to read. He worked longer hours. He volunteered for the overnight shifts that other supervisors avoided, the ones that ran from 8 in the evening to 8 in the morning and offered long stretches of low call volume during which the supervisor was effectively alone with the inventory room. He had lost weight. His skin had taken on the particular pallor of someone whose sleep was being mediated chemically. On at least one occasion, a senior paramedic later told investigators, he had appeared at the start of a shift with eyes that did not track right. The paramedic had said nothing. He had liked the supervisor. He had not wanted to be the one to raise it. He told the investigators later that he wished he had. In the summer of 2021, the conduct began to change. The exact pivot point is not documented in the federal case file in a way that fixes it to a day, but the indictment dates the tampering conduct to the final months of his employment, which the prosecution placed in roughly the second half of 2021 and the first weeks of 2022. The change was operational, and it was severe. Pattinson stopped only stealing. He began swapping. The mechanism was deliberate. He removed a vial of fentanyl from the locked cabinet. He withdrew the fentanyl from the vial. He refilled the vial with a clear liquid that the federal investigation later identified as believed to be saline. He resealed the vial in a way that, to a paramedic glancing at the cabinet inventory or at the narcotics kit on the ambulance, would make the vial look unopened. He returned the vial to the locked cabinet. He altered the corresponding log entry to make the cabinet inventory and the documented activity consistent. And then, in the ordinary course of Denver Health's resupply rotation, the resealed vial was placed in a narcotics kit on an ambulance. The federal case is built around what happened next. The tampered vials were not isolated. They went into kits. The kits went onto ambulances. the ambulances went to calls. A Denver health crew responding to an opioid overdose on Federal Boulevard, a stabbing in the Lodo Bar District, a heart attack in a Capitol Hill walk-up, a high-speed crash on Interstate 25 could have reached into the narcotics kit, drawn what the label said was fentanyl, administered it to a patient who needed it, and delivered clear liquid that was not what the patient needed and did not do what the labeled drug would have done. The vial would look right. The label would read right. The seal would look intact. The crew would have no way to know. This is the architectural moment that Judge Charlotte N. Sweeney would later describe in her pre-sentencing order, and it is the moment that the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Colorado built its case around. The risk it created was not theoretical. The vials were already in service. We're heading into the discovery and the federal investigation now. If you've made it this far, you already understand what makes this case different from a standard drug diversion. Subscribe if you want to see how the system finally caught up to him. The end of this story is not what most viewers expect. The catalyst came from inside Denver Health. In January 2022, a routine internal review of Paramedic Department narcotics records surfaced something that did not reconcile. The exact form of the irregularity is not detailed in the public federal record, but the structure of these reviews is consistent across major hospital systems. Pharmacy compared cabinet inventory against shift documentation, against patient administration records, and found a discrepancy that the existing supervisory sign-offs could not explain. The discrepancy was assigned for internal investigation. The internal investigators were not paramedics. They were hospital compliance staff who reported to a chain of authority outside the paramedic division. That distinction was important. The paramedic division could not bury this one. The compliance chain pulled records. They pulled cabinet logs against ambulance kit logs against patient charts. They pulled time cards. They pulled supervisory sign-offs. They looked for the dates on which the inventory had diverged from the documented use, and they looked at which supervisor had been on duty when the divergences had been signed off. The compliance investigation pointed at one supervisor. Denver Health did not handle it internally. The hospital's compliance leadership made a decision that, in the aftermath, the DEA's Rocky Mountain Field Division would publicly praise. They notified federal authorities. The notification went to the DEA Rocky Mountain Field Division and to the FDA Office of Criminal Investigations Kansas City Field Office, which has jurisdiction over consumer product tampering offenses. The hospital simultaneously terminated Pattinson's employment. His last day as a paramedic in the United States was a winter day in January 2022. He left the Bannock Street headquarters for the last time without a uniform and without a badge. He did not know, on the drive home, the full scope of what the next year would bring. He knew enough. The internal investigation also reached a conclusion that Denver Health would later make public. The hospital's review found that no patients had been harmed and no patients had gone without medication because of Pattinson's actions. That finding became the hospital's institutional answer to the question that everyone in Denver, in the days after the case broke, was asking. The federal prosecution did not contest the finding, but it did not build the case around it either. The federal case was about risk. The risk had already been created. The vials had been in the field for months. DEA and FDA agents arrived at Denver Health within days. The investigation was led from the federal side by Acting Special Agent in Charge David Oleski of the DEA Rocky Mountain Field Division and Special Agent in Charge Charles L. Grinstead of the FDA Office of Criminal Investigations Kansas City Field Office. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Colorado assigned the case to its healthcare prosecution unit. The evidence base built quickly. The hospital's internal investigation had already pulled the narcotics logs and identified the discrepancies. The federal agents took possession of the originals. They subpoenaed the pharmacy's reconciliation records. They subpoenaed Pattinson's time cards and his supervisory shift assignments and matched them against the dates on which the cabinet inventory had diverged from the documented use. The pattern resolved into something the indictment could carry. Hundreds of altered entries across 4 years, attributable to one supervisor's signature, lined up against an inventory deficit of approximately 1,900 vials. The smoking gun was the cabinet itself. Federal agents secured the locked narcotics supply cabinet and the vials that were in it at the moment of Pattinson's termination, and they secured the vials that had been distributed into the ambulance narcotics kits that were still in rotation. Forensic chemistry from the FDA's laboratory examined the contents of vials that had been refilled. The vials that should have contained fentanyl at the labeled concentration contained instead a clear liquid that the agency identified as consistent with saline solution. The seals had been replaced in a way that, to the eye, made the vials look unopened. Under closer examination, the resealing technique was identifiable. A working paramedic, knowing what to look for, would have caught it. A paramedic reaching into a narcotics kit on a moving ambulance en route to a cardiac arrest was not going to be looking for it. The lab reports were the case. They moved Pattinson's conduct in the federal indictment from a drug diversion theft scheme into a tampering scheme. Tampering with a consumer product under federal law requires that the defendant tampered with a consumer product with reckless disregard for the risk that another person would be placed in danger of death or bodily injury. The labeled fentanyl vials, distributed into ambulance narcotics kits to be used on emergency calls, met that standard on the prosecution's reading. The 20 counts of tampering with a consumer product in the federal indictment correspond to the tampering conduct documented in the final months. The 38 counts of obtaining a controlled substance by deception correspond to the broader pattern of theft. The text record was thin. Investigators recovered some communications between Pattinson and other parties from the period of the conduct, but the case did not turn on a paper trail of incriminating messages. Pattinson had not bragged. He had not confided. The evidence was the architecture itself, the cabinet, the logs, the vials, the seals, the chemistry. There was no co-conspirator. The federal case identified Pattinson as the sole defendant. The diversion and the tampering had been a one-person operation, made possible by a supervisor role that put a single individual on both sides of the institutional check. The confrontation, as the federal record reflects it, was not a dramatic doorway moment. It was a sequence of meetings. The first was with Denver Health Compliance in January 2022, in a conference room on a floor of the hospital that line paramedics rarely visit. Pattinson sat across a table from a compliance officer and a senior member of the medical staff. He was shown the cabinet records and the discrepancies. He was asked direct questions. The session was not a sworn proceeding. It did not need to be. His response, as multiple participants later relayed in different forms to the federal investigation, was the response of a man who knew the architecture of his own conduct better than anyone in the room. He did not deny the discrepancies. He did not offer an alternative reconciliation. He listened. He answered narrowly. At one point he asked whether he should have an attorney present. The compliance officer told him that was his decision. The meeting ended. His employment ended the same day. The second confrontation came months later, after the federal indictment came down. The DEA and FDA agents who interviewed him conducted that meeting under the procedural rules that apply to a federal target. He had counsel. The interview was structured. The federal record does not contain a verbatim transcript, but the structural fact of his guilty plea, entered before trial, indicates that there was no factual dispute the defense was prepared to litigate. The third confrontation was the one the public eventually saw, and it was not a confrontation at all. It was the sentencing hearing. By the time Pattinson walked into Judge Sweeney's courtroom in April 2023, the architecture of the case had hardened into a record. He had pleaded guilty. The numbers were not in dispute. 1,900 vials, 4 years of conduct, 20 counts of tampering, 38 counts of deception. He was there to be sentenced. The federal grand jury for the District of Colorado returned the indictment in 2022, charging Pattinson with 58 counts, 20 counts of tampering with a consumer product, 38 counts of obtaining a controlled substance by deception. He entered a plea of guilty. The case proceeded directly to sentencing. The sentencing hearing took place on April 19, 2023, before U.S. District Judge Charlotte N. Sweeney of the District of Colorado. The defense filed a motion in advance of sentencing asking for a sentence below the recommended range, citing Pattinson's substance use disorder, his clean prior criminal record, his decades of service to the city as a first responder, and his acceptance of responsibility. The government's filing pushed in the other direction. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Colorado argued that the tampering conduct, in particular, warranted a sentence that reflected the risk it had created. Judge Sweeney issued a pre-sentencing order that addressed the defense motion head-on. Her language became the public face of the case. She wrote that the crimes carried with them very real, very dangerous risks. Those risks, she wrote, included the obvious danger of a critically injured patient receiving saline or some other non-drug substance instead of fentanyl, but also the risks inherent in a certified medical provider working while high. The defendant was a supervisor, she wrote, and his job required him to respond to certain emergency situations and to supervise and provide direction to paramedics providing patient care. His impaired state, she wrote, could have resulted in accident while driving to an emergency scene, or affected the care provided to patients and supervision of emergency responders. She sentenced Pattinson to 3 years in federal prison. The sentence was followed by 3 years of supervised release. Restitution was ordered to Denver Health. Judge Sweeney specifically recommended that the Bureau of Prisons house Pattinson in a facility with a residential drug abuse program, the federal RDAP, which is the most intensive substance use intervention available inside the federal system, and the one that produces the strongest outcomes for defendants, whose offenses arise from active addiction. The DEA's public statement following the sentencing came from acting SAC Oleski and went directly to the institutional dimension of the offense. Trust, Oleski said, is the cornerstone of a patient's relationship with the medical community. Mr. Pattinson violated that trust. U.S. Attorney Cole Finnegan, in the same release, addressed the broader audience of credentialed medical professionals working under the pressure of their own substance use issues. Drug addiction is tragic, Finnegan said, but it is no excuse for harming patients. This conduct will send you to prison for a long time. The paramedics who had worked under Pattinson read the sentencing coverage the way EMS workers across the country read it. Some of them had ridden as line paramedics on his shifts. Some of them had drawn vials from cabinets he had signed off on. Some of them had administered fentanyl to a patient in the back of a moving rig in a 4-month window when, by the federal government's account, some unknown number of those vials had not contained the labeled drug at the labeled concentration. Denver Health's internal finding that no patients had been harmed answered the institutional question. It did not answer the personal question that lingered for the paramedics on those crews. Denver Health issued its own statement after sentencing. The hospital reiterated that the internal investigation had found that no patients had been harmed and no patients had gone without medication because of Pattinson's actions. The hospital noted that safeguards had been in place before the incident and that opioid control protocols had been enhanced since. The statement did not name the specific protocol changes. The institutional response was a closed-door reform, made visible only by the absence of a second case. Pattinson was designated to a federal facility with a residential drug abuse program, in accordance with Judge Sweeney's recommendation. His paramedic credentials were revoked. The Colorado State Board completed an administrative proceeding running parallel to the federal case. A man who had spent his entire adult life in the back of an ambulance would not work in emergency medical services again. What the case left behind was the harder institutional question. The system Pattinson exploited was not unusual. The supervisor on both sides architecture is standard practice across major urban EMS systems. Denver Health's enhanced opioid control protocols are one hospital's answer to one case. The broader question of how a hospital narcotics management system survives the corruption of the supervisor who runs it does not have an industry-wide answer yet. What the prosecution and the sentence established is the consequence side of the equation. A paramedic supervisor who took 1,900 vials of fentanyl out of a city EMS system over 4 years and who in the final months refilled the vials with what investigators identified as saline and put them back in service on ambulances responding to the worst emergencies in Denver, drew 3 years in federal prison. This case was disturbing, but the case on the right-hand side is even more shocking. Click it now.